On October the 25th, 1983, the United States invaded Grenada. It was, some believe, a forerunner to a much bigger invasion of Nicaragua. Imagine for a moment that you and your family live in one of the poorest regions of the world, Central America, often called the backyard of the United States. It's likely your home is in the countryside, a one-room shack in which there's no lavatory, no electricity, no clean drinking water. And imagine that at least 2 or 3 times in your life you watch helpless as a brother or sister or a small son or daughter falls ill with something simple and preventable, like diarrhea or measles, and dies. In your community, there's hardly anyone who can read or write except the priest and the moneylender. If you're lucky, you may get a few months' work picking cotton or cutting cane for 40 pence a day from dawn to dusk. And perhaps you'll wonder why your labor produces luxury goods and food for export to self-sufficient countries like the United States and Britain, while you and your family are permanently hungry. But if you wonder aloud about this, you put yourself at great risk, and you may even end up on a rubbish tip, murdered. That is what happens in the small nations of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Until 1979, it also happened in Nicaragua. Then almost all the people of Nicaragua rose up against a tyrant called Somoza, whose family had been in power for more than 40 years, put there by the United States Marines. That uprising cost 50,000 lives, almost as many as died for America in Vietnam, but out of a population of less than 3 million people. This film is about the people of Nicaragua and their unique struggle to end a cycle of poverty and humiliation. It is also about a threat, which, according to President Reagan, this tiny country presents to the most powerful and richest nation on earth. This threat, says Reagan, is communist penetration in Central America. But the real threat is this. Children once denied education under the Somozas now have the same right to school as do children in Britain. This botany class did not exist while Somoza was in power, when even the youngest children labored in the fields. In the past 4 years, 2,500 new schools have been built. And this is the threat. These middle-aged peasant women can read and write for the first time in their lives. In the past 4 years, illiteracy has been cut to less than 10% of the population. And this is the threat. Polio has been wiped out. Infant mortality has been cut by 1/3. Serious malnutrition has been dramatically reduced. A national health service has been established in spite of pitifully meager resources. And this is the threat. Open roads, freedom of movement. In a region of turmoil, there's no curfew, no menace from within. It is ironic that Nicaragua is one of the few countries in Latin America where the United States ambassador is able to stroll in safety through the streets.
Patria libre!
The uprising against Somoza embraced all classes, from right to left, rich and poor, and was led by the Sandinistas. There are few families in Nicaragua who haven't lost a loved one in the fighting. This woman, Maria Elena, lost her son, whom she believes was tortured. She has never found his body.
I tell the American people, and Reagan in particular, because I know not all the people are against us. I'd say, why doesn't this man leave us in peace? Even if it means they lend us nothing, they give us nothing at all. Because we are extremely poor people. But please will he leave us in peace. If he'd leave us alone, this revolution could have done wonders, because even though so many things haven't been done, a lot has already been achieved.
To understand events in Central America today and the threat of an independent Nicaragua, it's important to look back.
won't you kindly open your geography? Let us turn to page 123. Between the Caribbean and the Pacific shore, you'll find the city of Amor. Managua, Nicaragua is a beautiful town. You buy an hacienda for a few pesos down.
Central America until recently has been in shadow, largely ignored by scholars and journalists, so that the epic struggles of its peoples and the names of their heroes were lost behind a facade of ridicule, the so-called banana republics. In 1823, President Monroe proclaimed what was modestly called the Monroe Doctrine. Its aim was to protect Latin America from the Europeans, regardless of whether the people of Latin America wanted to be protected. This paternalism later became known as America's manifest destiny, that is, America's God-given right to control its own hemisphere. Early in the 20th century, manifest destiny took on a new meaning. It was now a crusade against Bolshevism, an imagined red threat in America's backyard. In 1912, US Marines landed in Nicaragua to protect democracy, as they put it, and to hold elections. But people in Nicaragua didn't want a foreign army to organize their elections, and resistance began behind a leader who said, "The issue is that the United States has no right to invade and humiliate a small country." His name was Augusto Sandino. He was a liberal and a nationalist, not a Marxist, and the Americans made the mistake of dismissing him as a bandit. Central America, said US Undersecretary of State Richard Olds, has always understood that governments which we recognize and support stay in power, while those we do not recognize and support fail. Major General Smedley Butler of the United States Marines later described his role with disarming frankness. "I was a racketeer for capitalism," he said. "I helped purify Nicaragua for international banking. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests. And I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies." Sandino and what was called his mad little army rejected all that. On July the 16th, 1927, he attacked the US Marines headquarters here at Ocotal in the north of Nicaragua. And that afternoon, across these hills, came a formation of de Havilland biplanes bearing United States markings. The planes formed into a column and dived at the center of town. With machine guns blazing, they dropped their bombs at 300 feet, and that is now believed to be the first use of organized dive bombing in history, long before the German Luftwaffe was credited with the innovation at Guernica in Spain. There were hundreds of casualties, and Sandino learned a lesson. From then on, he became a master of guerrilla warfare, of attacking and melting away, tactics which were to be adopted around the world and to change much of the world over the next 50 years. By 1933, Sandino's mad little army had defeated the Marines, driving them from Nicaragua, a lesson of history apparently overlooked today. Sandino went to Managua for peace talks, where he was betrayed by America's man, Somoza, the head of the National Guard. In 1934, he was murdered. There was a calypso sung in American nightclubs in the 1940s that began like this. A guy asked the dictator if he had any farms. The dictator said he had only one. It was Nicaragua. Anastasio Somoza founded a dynasty that ran Nicaragua like a family business for 44 years. The Somozas owned almost half of all the arable land in Nicaragua. They controlled the coffee, sugar, and beef industries. Nothing was overlooked. They owned the national airline outright. If you bought a Mercedes car, you bought it from a Somoza company. Even the paving stones in the streets were made by a Somoza cement factory, which got the contract from a Somoza ministry, and of course the profits went to El Presidente. The Somozas were protected by a private army called the National Guard, which the United States created, paid, and armed. Somoza called them his boys, and they tortured almost as a sport. This is the Messiah volcano, which, as you can see, is very much alive. One of the delights of Somoza's boys was to drop his opponents from helicopters into the volcano. The official American attitude to Somoza was best summed up by President Roosevelt. That guy, he said, may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. The first Somoza began his career as a sewerage inspector and went on to own the sewers of Nicaragua, right up to the manhole covers. This is the remains of another Somoza interest after the Sandinistas had got through with it, a notorious blood factory known as the House of Dracula, to which poor Nicaraguans would sell their blood for as little as $1 a litre in order to buy food. The blood would then be sold to the United States for 10 times that amount. The year was 1978, 1 year before the uprising. This was Somoza's National Guard, or Death Squad. Funded as part of America's foreign aid program, they were the instrument of American policy in Nicaragua for almost half a century. They were taught to equate all forms of social unrest with communist subversion. They were above the law. They could murder at will. Now reorganized in Honduras and paid by the CIA, they are described by President Reagan as freedom fighters. In 1972, an earthquake destroyed Managua and killed an estimated 10,000 people. The National Guard were quick to react. They diverted aid from abroad, they looted, and one officer reportedly tried to blow open the National Bank. In the center of Managua, this children's playground was built immediately after the fall of Somoza on the rubble of the earthquake. Somoza had repeatedly refused to build parks and playgrounds in much the same way that he resisted doing anything about the 83% malnutrition or diseases affecting young children. He did, however, find $1 million to send in cash to President Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972. Nixon had said of Somoza, "Now that's the kind of anti-communist we like to see down there." When the earthquake struck, the return on this investment was beyond Somoza's wildest dreams. The United States gave him emergency aid of $57 million, most of it out of US government funds. But the Nicaraguan Treasury reported receiving only $16 million. There was no inquiry about the missing $41 million. Indeed, more of the same just kept rolling in. With the support of the Carter administration, the International Monetary Fund gave Somoza $65 million, just a few months before he fled the country and while he was bombing his own people.
Well, it's important to remember that we found a country in July 79 that had probably 40% of the infrastructure of the country destroyed by the war, and part of it destroyed by the earthquake in 1972, and Somoza didn't repair it, okay? The city of Managua is a very good example of that. Then we found a country with no financial resources. The Sandinista government nationalized 19 different banks, and we found only $3.5 million in the 19 banks. That means 1 day of imports for this country. On the other hand, we inherited an external debt of $1.6 billion, and probably half, $800 million, never were used in this country, were parked in Miami or Switzerland. However, we are now servicing this debt.
In 1982, the World Bank congratulated Nicaragua for repaying the debts of Somoza, for generously treating the private sector with incentives, and for substantial progress in health and education. At the same time, the bank regretted having to cut back urgently needed loans to Nicaragua because of, to quote, increasing political limitations. In other words, pressure from Washington.
We have been suffering in the last 2 years a sort of financial boycott. The private banks refused to lend to Nicaragua. The multilateral banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, have reduced close to 50% the loans to Nicaragua. And that means that we have shortages of medicines, We have shortages of food. We had the boycott of the wheat. Now we had the boycott of our sugar exports to the United States. We have a boycott of some spare parts that are not coming on time for the crops. Then is a scarcity of foreign exchange that affects the industrial production, affects the agricultural production, and that affects the normal standard of living of the people. Still, they are happy under these conditions. And they are not easy conditions. They are appalling conditions many times. Check with the people if they prefer this life, very simple life, very austere life, to the life under Somoza. What is going here is that the people realize that this is their own economy, this is their own country, and they are facing an aggression, a foreign aggression. This revolution was not made by a proletariat party. It was produced by a popular insurrection. Everybody took part in the destruction of the dictatorship. This is not a political party. It's a front who made the revolution. And you have in this front different parties, the Socialist Party, the Christian Democratic Party, the Liberals, the Conservatives, all of them took part in this insurrection. Christians, the same time with Marxists, took part in this insurrection. The church, many priests and nuns supported the insurrection, even fought in the insurrection. Now, after 4 years, this is a country that has 60% of the GDP in the hands of the private sector, after 4 years of revolution. This is a country in which the agrarian reform, instead of distributing land to the public enterprises, to the state enterprises, is distributing land to cooperatives and to private peasants. We nationalize all the Somocista land, and this is probably about 35% of the total land of the country, okay? We have created here about 3,500 cooperatives in 4 years, and these cooperatives will provide the self-sufficiency in basic food probably next year. And this country will be self-sufficient in basic food. Grains, rice, corn, beans, some vegetables, fruits. And this is essential. That's why there is a slogan here, defense and production. Then production is part of the defense system. If we are able to provide food to the people, health, education, this country is invincible.
Land reform in Nicaragua follows no model. This cooperative is the Sandinistas' ideal, which, as British visitors are constantly reminded, began at Toad Lane in Rochdale in 1844. Unlike Cuba, there is no state farm monopoly. An individual can own as much land as he can work, as long as he does not leave it idle and he reinvests and he pays decent wages. Most of the principal export crops, cotton, coffee, beef and sugar, remain in private hands. Indeed, small private owners are encouraged to accept loans offering low interest rates. In the past 4 years, food production and consumption of basic foods has increased by as much as 100%. Washington says there are food queues in Nicaragua. This is the market in Managua on a normal day. Most revolutions have wanted to appease their ideals and make their supporters happy with theories soaked in blood. The French, the American and the Russian revolutions have all resulted in vengeance and mass murder. Is Nicaragua any different? Well, this is the maximum security prison at Tipitapa. One of the first things the Sandinistas did was to abolish the death penalty, and it's here that members of Somoza's National Guard are serving sentences for murder and torture. I've come to the prison with Thomas Borge, Minister of the Interior in the Sandinista government, and himself a victim of torture in this same prison. Thomas Borge was sentenced to 129 years by Somoza. He was kept hooded, naked, half-starved. While he was in prison, his wife was raped and murdered, and he later found her in a mass grave.
Hay una enorme variedad A whole range of crimes were committed here. For example, there were National Guards who not only killed Nicaraguans, but also tortured them. There were cases where people's skin was scraped off with shaving knives, alive. Others where their eyes were gouged out with spoons. Others were castrated. There was a range of cruelty here which I don't think would fit into an encyclopedia.
Today in Nicaragua, says Amnesty International, no allegations of torture have been substantiated. In individual cases of ill treatment, Amnesty told us, those responsible have been punished by the Nicaraguan authorities.
I have a sort of amnesia about everything that happened here. Today, I don't remember the bad moments. I've rubbed them from my memory. I think that to remember bad moments is a way of retaining bitterness. I prefer to forget, so that the bitterness and grudges can be replaced with compassion.
Such an attitude has helped to create a possibly unique example of penal reform. This is the only fence on this farm which is also a prison. There are no guards. The staff consists of 2 agricultural teachers. This prisoner was Somoza's personal bodyguard and is described as a former brute, now almost rehabilitated. Here, the only potential weapons are these machetes, which the prisoners are trusted to use in clearing a baseball pitch. In 2 years, 1 man has walked away. Of course, there is a risk and a dilemma to all this. Since the Sandinistas came to power, they have let go 2,500 National Guardsmen, and many of them went straight to Honduras, where they were signed up and armed by the CIA. President Reagan has said, "We do not seek to overthrow the government of Nicaragua." This week, November the 15th, 1983, more than 4,000 American combat troops will have arrived in Honduras for what are called maneuvers close to the border with Nicaragua. American troops, says President Reagan, will strike back if they are attacked. President Kennedy gave the same assurance 20 years ago, shortly before the beginning of America's longest war. This was Nicaragua on June the 20th, 1979, a month before the fall of Somoza. The man you see on the ground is Bill Stewart, an American TV reporter. The man standing with a gun is an officer of Somoza's National Guard.
Let him see the picture, or the camera.
Bill Stewart was an ordinary reporter doing his job. His murder on television shocked many Americans and helped to break an historical pattern. For the first time, Washington found it very difficult to justify sending troops to intervene on behalf of their man, Somoza, whom President Carter only a few months earlier had personally congratulated on the improvement on human rights in Nicaragua. On the first anniversary of Bill Stewart's death, here at this street corner in a poor district, a monument was erected. And I, for one, find what it says most moving. In memory of Bill Stewart, he didn't die on foreign soil, and we keep his memory alive because he is part of free Nicaragua. Such is the generosity of spirit so often shown in this small country. In the same barrio, more than 200 young Nicaraguans died fighting the National Guard. One of them was this woman's son, Julio. Her name is Lupita, and she carried her son's tortured body back from the front line and buried it in this, her small dirt garden. Her other son, Manuel, simply disappeared.
Dijo opiniones personales sobre la agresión. Es bastante.
My personal opinion about the aggression is that these people have no feelings whatsoever, because they lived exactly as they pleased for 50 years. We the poor, and we really are poor, we struggled to earn our daily bread with the pittance we were paid. Yes, I have an opinion about this aggression. Let President Reagan spare a thought that he has children. Let him think that he is supporting genocide. They were murderers here. They had no pity for the young people. It was a crime in Nicaragua to be young. Those brutes, we don't want them in Nicaragua. They carry on killing young men on the borders.
For the people of Nicaragua, those like Lupita, the invasion of their country is imminent yet again. The following is a summary of United States intervention in its so-called backyard. 1898, President McKinley orders U.S. troops to invade Cuba. 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt orders the invasion of Honduras. 1912, President Taft orders the invasion of Nicaragua. 1914 to 18, President Wilson invades Haiti, Cuba, and Panama. 1924 to 26, President Coolidge invades Nicaragua and Honduras. 1954, Eisenhower approves the overthrow of the elected government of Guatemala. 1961, Kennedy approves a CIA invasion of Cuba. 1965, Johnson invades the Dominican Republic. 1973, Nixon approves the overthrow of the elected government of Chile. 1981, President Reagan approves the CIA secret war against Nicaragua. 1983, President Reagan orders the invasion of Grenada. Their legacy is this remarkable United States military encirclement of the region, a vast ring of Americans on land, sea, and in the air, allowing a rapid deployment force to cover any eventuality, Grenada being the latest example. Since President Reagan came to power, this threat has been turned increasingly against Nicaragua. There have been bombing raids flown by insurgents based in Costa Rica to the south, and from Honduras to the north, the CIA directs, pays, and arms former members of Somoza's National Guard, known as the Contra, some of whom are trained in illegal camps in Florida. Last July, the secret war came into the open with the arrival off Nicaragua of 2 American naval task forces, each with more firepower than the entire U.S. fleet in World War II. Today, 4,000 American combat troops are poised in Honduras, near the border. Ranged against them in Nicaragua are 45 aging Eastern Bloc tanks unsuitable for mountainous jungle and which are liable to break down after 125 miles, plus 3 antiquated Korean War jets, 2 helicopters, a navy consisting of a few patrol boats, a regular army of 22,000 and 25,000 reserves, and a militia. In addition to the threat from outside, the Nicaraguans face 15,000 of these troops, the Contra, heavily armed by the Americans and operating a hit-and-run war from Honduras. This is effectively a CIA private army. Its original aim was to stop the alleged flow of arms from the Sandinistas to the guerrillas in El Salvador. But this was no more than a cover. No convincing proof has ever been produced in public to substantiate a continuing flow of arms, a pretext described by a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee as a farce. The real aim of the Contra is to give the appearance of a civil war in Nicaragua by hitting economic targets and killing people like midwives.
I work, for example, training traditional attendants in the north of the country. That's my work.
That's midwife attendants?
Yes, midwife attendants. Because in this country, most of the deliveries have been performed or made by midwife. I've been working in areas where 6 of my students have been murdered by counter-revolutionary groups coming from Honduras. And my program was finished because of that. That was in May 1982. But now we have restarted again because it's marvelous. I remember when a health worker was murdered. She was a nurse. And we had a meeting after the murder, and 10 nurses were willing to go there and work as she did in the past.
The morning I spoke to Susana, a young man, Julio Moncada, was ambushed by a gang of Contra and murdered. His job was organizing land reform, and therefore he was clearly a threat.
Julio Moncada wasn't political at all. He just loved his people.
And what was the purpose of killing him, do you think?
I think they want to stop technicians going to the countryside. They want to make people afraid, feel afraid, not going to the countryside to help peasants. And for that reason, I think they are killing technicians now. In the past, they were health workers, and now they are agrarian reform technicians.
These are other victims of the CIA war. Young Sandinista troops at a hospital which, when we filmed there, had 2 months' supply of medicines left. And that was 2 months ago. This volunteer militia boy is 14 years old. He was shot and burned while defending his village. They've been called the gang that couldn't shoot straight. The old gang who gave America Vietnam are back, building new careers with a new war in Central America. John Negroponte, American ambassador to Honduras, runs the CIA's secret war. Negroponte helped to run the Vietnam War as a political officer in Saigon and under Henry Kissinger in Washington. Robert Comer, otherwise known as Blowtorch Bob, is a former CIA expert on pacification, meaning terror. Blowtorch Bob failed to pacify Vietnam, but now works for the Pentagon, advising on how to pacify Nicaragua. Nestor Sanchez, 28 years in the CIA, helped to mount the abortive invasion of Cuba in 1961. He is now a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. I interviewed Mr. Sanchez at the Pentagon before the invasion of Grenada, which he helped to arrange. What do you say to critics of the administration who say the Nicaraguan government has the majority support? There's every evidence that they have the majority of the support of the people. Therefore, that surely should be enough for the United States not to participate in the so-called destabilization of that regime.
First of all, I believe there is sufficient evidence to indicate that the Sandinista government does not have the support of the majority of the Nicaraguan people. I believe that a poll which was taken about a year ago, even at that time, indicated that. The people who have...
Which poll was that, excuse me?
This was a poll that was taken by the church. It was a rather informal poll, as in a country like that you can't really poll, but an informal poll was taken.
Is that the only evidence that you have?
No, the other evidence also is that the democratic freedom fighters, if you may call them, the Contras that have gone in there, have found that the people where they have, the areas that they have gone into, this has been reported by our media, by our newspapermen who have visited with the Contras in the area, and they have found that the campesinos in these areas have freely joined the Contras.
The administration has said that international communism, fueled by the Soviet Union and the Cubans, is responsible for the present situation in Central America. What does that really mean?
The facts are that the communists, the Soviets, the Cubans, are not responsible for the root problems that exist in the area. They're taking advantage of a situation which has existed for a long time, and are therefore consolidating the break that they got in Nicaragua, consolidating their position in that country, and proceeding, as they openly state, to export their subversion and their terror to other countries in an effort to liberate these countries from imperialism. I think it's clearly stated by them as to what their goals are, what their objectives are. It's no secret. Fidel Castro has said it many times, and so have the other countries.
And think about this Soviet plot, Marxist Leninism. I think Nicaragua is very interesting in this aspect. There is a nationalistic movement that is in the root of Sandinism. Sandino was in the 30s. He probably didn't know at all about Marxism, but he was a nationalist fighter, freedom fighter. Then you have the tremendous power, influence of the church here. And these people are extremely Christian, extremely Christian. And the main leaders, even though some of them are not Christian now, they have a Christian heritage. And there is a Marxist influence here, very important, very important. And I think the confluence, the convergence of nationalism, Christianism, and Marxism, and a very Latin American sort of Marxism, what we call a Creole Marxism, that has roots in the Indian culture, in the Latin American culture. That's the essence of what is going here. And that's why this revolution is a Sandinista revolution. It's Marxist, it's Christian, and it's nationalistic at the same time.
Could you explain the two churches here, the People's Church on the one hand and the Established Church on the other?
Some people talk about the popular church and the hierarchical church. Well, a church that is not popular is not Christian. To be Christian is to have an option for the poor, for the oppressed, for the underprivileged. This is the basic option of the gospel. Then we never use the slogan of the popular church. We talk about the church of the poor, the grassroots communities.
But there is a division, isn't there? And there's a conflict between the Church of the Poor and the established church in this country as represented by the Archbishop.
It's a dramatic division. And after the visit of the Pope, this division increased, unfortunately. But there is not a religious division. It is not a theological division. It's a political, social division. The church that supports a popular alternative, a popular model of building a new society, and a church that would like to have a much more traditional Christian democratic model.
Which side is the Pope on?
That's a real difficult question. Obviously, the Pope is with the poor in Poland.
In Poland? Poland. Which side is he on in Nicaragua?
Well, when the Pope came here, I think due to the bad information that he received, with the disinformation that he received before coming here, he was unable to understand what was going here.
That's a very polite way of putting it. I think the bad information he got. But I mean, a lot of oblique things were said when the Pope was here.
Yeah.
Did he understand? Did the Vatican, let's say, did the established Roman Church understand what its Roman flock in Nicaragua were doing?
No, unfortunately, no. This is a new experience, a new revolution in which Christians took and are taking a very important part building this new nation, and this is very difficult to understand to the Vatican because there is a revolution here. The Vatican doesn't know too much about revolutions, and then it's difficult for the Vatican to understand what is going here. That's a fact.
The Pope makes a habit of blessing the governments of countries he visits. He even blessed the regime of General Jaruzelski in Poland and the regime in El Salvador. An exception was Nicaragua, which has 4 priests in its cabinet. It is ironic that the Vatican, together with the Reagan administration, appears to be doing to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua what Moscow is doing to Solidarity in Poland. Why do you think that President Reagan accuses you people of being communists.
All that is communism for Reagan because the role that Christianity plays in the cultural framework of Reagan is to legitimize the established powers of the world. The church has been always with the big capital, with the big institutions, with big countries. Only in exceptions, the church worked with the poor, with the underdeveloped, with the third world countries. Now, if the church starts legitimizing the poor, the independence of these small countries, the church is delegitimizing the established powers, then the church is a subversive element. And that's why they identify subversion of an order that is oppressed for the majority of our people with communism. And Monsignor Romero, the Archbishop in El Salvador, was a subversive and a communist.
And he was shot?
Was shot. We, all of us, we are communists, according to Reagan, according to Vice President Bush. What to do?
If Archbishop Romero's support for ordinary people made him a communist, then these 3 American nuns and a religious lay worker were also communists. Indeed, Jeane Kirkpatrick, America's representative at the UN, suggested that the nuns were communist sympathizers. They were raped and murdered by members of the National Guard of El Salvador, a country where 35,000 people have been the victims of death squads since 1980. The American ambassador at the time was Robert White. He said, "The chief killers here are the government security forces. They are the ones responsible for the deaths of thousands upon thousands of young people who have been executed merely on the suspicion that they are leftists. Are we really going to be part of all that?" For saying that, the ambassador was sacked. This year, the Reagan administration wants to give to the El Salvador regime more than $200 million in aid. By contrast, there are no death squads in Nicaragua, where all American aid has been stopped. How does a small country in Central America radically alter the cycle of poverty that has been a feature of life down there for so long without being seen in the United States as a challenge or even a threat?
I believe that kind of a challenge we accept. We want to help these countries redress the years of poverty that they've lived in. But we certainly don't see the solution in letting them become a country under communist domination and rule. We don't believe that this will help their economies or their people.
You mentioned letting these countries have a certain kind of government. But that leads to the question, does the United States have the moral right to intervene in Central America?
Well, if I did say to let these countries do something, I retract that statement, because what we want to do is to help these countries in their development. One of the problems that we have had throughout the years in Central America is that we haven't had a consistent long-term policy in the area. I have said this before, and I will say it again here with you this afternoon. We have paid attention to the area when we have a crisis there. And certainly this has not helped in the long-term development. With what is happening there today, it would be certainly my hope that we would be able to help these countries over a long period of time, because this is not a situation which lends itself to an overnight solution. It's one in which we will have to stay there for a long period of time if we want to help, and help them along the lines of our Caribbean Basin initiative, to where we will give incentives for investment in the area, and we will also provide tax relief on imports for their goods into our country. This, over a long period of time, we feel will help our neighbors in this hemisphere.
We have tried in these 4 years to be very flexible, very pragmatic, We have tried to diversify our dependency from the United States without breaking with the United States. We would like to maintain our diplomatic relations, our economic relations with the United States, but not to have a sort of umbilical cordon with the United States. We try to be our own nation, okay? I think what is happening here is essential for the future of third world countries. Here is a sort of new international law that is at stake here. Have we the right, small, poor, underdeveloped nations in the periphery of the global system, have we the right to be independent nations? Have we the right to build our own security policies? Have we the right to define our new economic models that will satisfy what we say the logic of the majority, the basic needs of our people, that will accept that the logic of the majority will be the logic that will create a new society and not the logic of transnational companies, of the logic of transnational capital? Have we the right to demand these things?
With 4,000 American troops now in maneuvers on the Honduran border, don't you see history repeating itself? The possibility of an invasion yet again?
I consider that we will be unable to stop the Marines in the border. That's impossible. They have all the military equipment. We don't have Air Force. We don't have a Navy to defend this country. They will come into the country. The problem is how they will go out of this country.
Mrs. Thatcher has given very strong support to President Reagan's policies in Central America. How important is the support of an ally like the British government to the fulfillment of those policies in Central America?
Such support is vital, is necessary, is very, very important to us. After all, Britain is a European ally with which we also have commitments through NATO, as you are well aware. And I think it's also a recognition, if I may say, on the British part to understand that if we do run into and have problems and have a military threat develop against the United States in the Caribbean, it will also affect the support that we will give NATO in the early parts of a war if one should break out in Europe. Recalling that over 50% of the supplies going to NATO in the early part of any war will be coming out of our Gulf ports. So I believe it is in our allies' interest. I wish we could see the same support, the same strong support that we're getting from our British allies, from all our other allies in Europe. We're seeing a change in that, and I believe this is all very desirable and very helpful to our policy that we're trying to carry out in Central America.
Do you see a direct role for NATO in the carrying out of the policy in Central America?
Not at the present time, and I don't think that's necessary. If we address these problems that we have in Central America today, we believe we can, by assisting these countries in, not NATO, but the individual countries probably could assist the Salvadorans and the Hondurans in the same way we're assisting them to take care of themselves, which is possible today. The crisis has not reached the point where interference from the outside or the use of, say, U.S. troops or the troops from any other country are necessary. It's still a manageable problem if we get on with it.
This pathological vision of the administration of the United States in relation to this area of the world is impossible to change. I have been 15 times in the last 2 years in the United States. It's impossible. They consider that this is democratic, that this is Christian, and this is part of the Western civilization. Then all what we are doing is totalitarian, anti-Christian, and communism. The only thing of changing the mentality of the U.S. administration is in the hands of the North American people. No other force in the world will transform this mentality. We are unable to do that.
In 1982, an all-party British parliamentary delegation reported from Nicaragua, "Our impression was of a government which retains the support of the majority of the population, a country working hard to recover from the disastrous inheritance of dictatorship." In 1983, a delegation of the World Council of Churches reported, "What impresses us is the pluralism in the government and the service of Christians, and the sense we get that the kind of totalitarianism so rampant in Latin America, in Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, simply does not exist in Nicaragua." Less than 11% of foreign aid to Nicaragua comes from the communist bloc. 50% of volunteers are from Cuba, mostly teachers and doctors. 40% are from the West and Latin America. More than 75% of Nicaragua's trade is with non-communist countries. The British government is one of the few Western governments to enthusiastically support President Reagan's policies in Central America, policies which are rejected by much of the Congress and, according to every survey, by most of the American people. Policies which are leading towards a war against a small country whose crime has been to cut the death rate of its young children, to teach its people to read and write, and to let them live as human beings with dignity. Surely it's fair to ask this: how impoverished, how helpless does a country have to be before it's no longer seen as a threat by the United States? Or perhaps President Reagan understands that the real threat of Nicaragua is simply that of a good example, and one desperately sought after from Central America to the Philippines to Poland. The example of a society inspired by neither the United States nor the Soviet Union. The generosity of spirit you have seen from Nicaragua will not be sustained by more suffering. If governments won't help them, why can't they leave them alone?